So, you're a DC McFarlane Multiverse collector. You're not a rare breed. A lot of people have already fallen in love with this line. And it's easy to see why. A lot of great characters, unique sculpts, unique builds, great paint jobs for the most part, ever-improving articulation and quality control. It's solid. But let's say that you want to have something a little bit more special than just a bunch of randos, right? Maybe you want to build up a team. Maybe a very specific team. I mean, granted, there's a few you could do. You could do the Teen Titans at this point, basically the full Justice League. But what if you're more interested in the villains? What if you wanted to say build, I don't know, a Legion of Doom? In this video, I'm just going over the figures that you can get from the line to build up a Legion of Doom shelf, and who I think are the best figures to fill up that shelf. So without further ado, let's talk about the Legion of Doom. For anyone who may not know, the Legion of Doom is one of the most celebrated and yet least utilized characters. Essentially, it is an evil Justice League made up of a band of villains that can fight each and every one of the main 7 heroes. They first appeared in Challenge of the Super Friends, which was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon from the 80s, in which you had a team led by Lex Luthor, whose whole goal was to defeat the Justice League and take over the world. Weirdly enough, as popular as the show was, the Legion of Doom didn't show up in the comics. It took many years until Alex Ross's Justice series for the Legion of Doom to come back, and even though that was with an expanded roster, the main members were still there and it was still in Slaughter Swamp, which was the swamp headquarters of the Legion. After that, they once again went on hiatus. The most notable version of the Legion of Doom to show up in a major piece of media is probably the Justice League Unlimited cartoon, in which Gorilla Grodd, one of the founding members of the original Legion, made the Secret Society. And even though they never actually referred to it as the Legion of Doom, they had the whole base in the swamp, they had the boardroom meetings, they had eventually Lex Luthor as the leader, evil team that is composed of multiple villains to fight multiple heroes to take over the world. It was the Legion of Doom, and for whatever reason, they just avoided using the name. So with all that said, it's weird to think that this group of villains, that even people who aren't really into comic books know, hasn't made more of a splash. You'd think that DC would have cashed in on the popularity of the Legion of Doom, and in other pieces of media, they have. Just look at the LEGO Batman games, where the Legion of Doom is very heavily showcased in LEGO Batman 3, and then are the main characters of LEGO DC supervillains. In spite of that, they still just don't show up all that often. But even with that, people adore the Legion, and for most collectors of DC, having a Legion of Doom shelf is considered a major goal, and it was definitely one of mine for many years. But now we hit the other issue, which is some of the members are very obscure and don't get that many figures. So that's why I'm making this video. If you have a DC McFarlane Multiverse shelf, these are the figures that I would honestly say make the best Legion of Doom on a relatively affordable budget. Let's get straight into it. We're going to go into each of the members, what their main goal is, what their deal is, and the figure that I would personally suggest for them. Lex Luthor, the smartest man alive and the richest man alive, is the arch enemy of Superman, and he needs no introduction. Aside from the Joker, he's probably the single most famous villain in all of DC and possibly all of comic books. Now, for Luthor, you have a lot of options. A lot of DC collectibles come to mind, especially some new 52 figures, but for me, I would stick with McFarlane and get up their original Luthor, their new 52 Luthor. Now you see, this figure is great. It has the standard Luthor design that we would think of, that being the power suit that isn't overly bulky. Aside from that, it has a great head sculpt. It's still very affordable, and even better, it was one of the figures to have a Platinum Edition, which if you bought it, it has a glow-up LED in the Lex Luthor chest insignia. Even though I don't have that version, I personally don't see a need for it. It would be an extra little piece to your display if you wanted it. With all that said, Luthor is probably the character here who has the most options, so I think going with this version, which is nice and simple and fits the needs while still having a lot of great character to the figure, is a really good way to go. Next up, we have Bizarro, Superman's misguided doppelganger. He's not really evil anymore, but he's definitely still a mainstay of the Legion. For him, you have fewer options. Once again, you have some great DC collectibles ideas, but I would personally just say go with the Multiverse McFarlane version. Now, granted, this is based on the Rebirth costume, so no red Speedos, but I think it still really works. It's a real ghastly looking Bizarro with great head sculpt and good body sculpting as a whole, really good hand options, and the colors are very saturated to make it look a little bit more worn and tired. I really like this Bizarro, and I can understand why some people might prefer the half-shiny New 52 version that DC Direct put out, but personally, I don't like a figure that's only half metallic, so I think this is definitely more in my wheelhouse. Knowing that Lex Luthor was the founder of the team, it only makes sense that they would have a lot of Superman villains, including Brainiac, Superman's other archenemy. Thing is, right, Brainiac, once again, kind of like Bizarro, despite being a mainstay of the Legion of Doom and Superman's mythos, he doesn't have that many figures, especially not in the 7-inch scale. Personally, even though this figure is a bit short for the scale I want, I use the DC Superheroes Brainiac. Because it was sculpted by the Four Horsemen, I think it looks amazing, and even though he didn't have this appearance in Challenge of the Super Friends, he did have this appearance in Super Friends, which gives it a little bit of an extra caveat to me. If you wanted a more traditional Brainiac, I would say go for the DC Essentials Brainiac. You would have the green skin, you'd have the black and white bodysuit, it would scale better, it would have better articulation. So it depends on, do you want to make your Legion of Doom more comic accurate or more Super Friends flavored? I went Super Friends flavored, which is why I got my Superheroes Brainiac, but there are at least two really good distinct options for you if you want a Brainiac. That's right, in a team of 13 villains, 4 of them are Superman villains. If anything, that really shows how much precedence Superman was given in the 80s over Batman. Because you know if the Legion of Doom was made today, it would mostly just be Batman villains. Thing is, right? Toyman is interesting. He's one of my favorite Superman villains, but he's not one that's particularly popular, and he does not get many figures. The only other figure that could kind of work maybe would be the DC Universe Classics Toyman, but one, he'd be an inch shorter than everyone else, which would really throw off the scaling. But two, that's the classic Toyman appearance, which some people like, I dig it. But me personally, Alex Ross's Toyman, the one where he actually looks like a marionette, this is my Toyman. I adore this figure. It's one of my absolute favorite figures in my collection, and it scales incredibly well with DC Multiverse figures, which is why I would personally say if you're building a Legion of Doom shelf, even if you're going for a Super Friends inspired flair, you should go get the Alex Ross Justice Toyman. It fits better, it looks better, it is better. Moving from Superman villains to Batman villains, let's talk about the Riddler. In terms of what to do about the Legion of Doom shelf, there's options, which are great, and I have 3 main ones. As you can see, the figure I personally use is the McFarlane Multiverse Arkham City Riddler. It's my favorite Riddler look, so I like using it the most. That said, if you wanted a more traditional suited Riddler from the comics, I would wholeheartedly recommend the New 52 Riddler, the one with the mutton chops. He is a spectacular looking figure and still goes for, decent money. Oh, but if you want to go more traditional and have a Riddler in tights as opposed to a suit, you have the new Collector's Edition Multiverse McFarlane Riddler coming out, which would work if you wanted to go for that more traditional Riddler appearance. But me, personally, I kind of need the suit and bowling hat. I am probably going to stick with the Arkham City Riddler, and if anything, if I were to replace it, I would replace it with the New 52 Riddler. Continuing with the Batman representation in Legion of Doom, you have the Scarecrow, the Master of Fear. Unfortunately, despite the fact that Scarecrow has always been a perennially high-ranking member of Batman's Rogues Gallery, this is another figure that just doesn't get many chances at being a figure. You have a few McFarlane options, right? You have the New Frontiers Scarecrow, which is very interesting but breaks from the traditional appearance a lot. You have the Batman Begins Scarecrow, which is probably the best option you have if you want a classic-looking Scarecrow, but me, personally, I hate the lack of articulation on that figure. You have a handful of options from DC Direct, including some people who would honestly say that the Arkham Asylum Scarecrow would work. I don't think it does, it's way too short. So that kind of just leaves you with the Arkham Knight Scarecrow. It's a very different appearance for Scarecrow, and I'll be honest, I don't like how monochromatic it is. I wish there was more paint on it than just the orange and gray. But it's a good Scarecrow, you know who the character is by looking at it, and it has a very striking appearance. It definitely works on the display. But truth be told, I would rather use my Arkham Asylum Scarecrow. The only thing that stops me from doing so is he's just too short. He doesn't work, he looks like a child compared to the rest, and Scarecrow is supposed to be very tall and lanky. So, what I'm really saying is, McFarlane, please just make a new Arkham Asylum Scarecrow, but until then, the Arkham Knight Scarecrow definitely works for what we're using it for. Completing our trio of Batman villains, you have Solomon Grundy. Yeah, that's right, in Challenge of the Super Friends, they put in Riddler, but did they put in any of the other A-listers like Catwoman, Joker, Penguin? No! They put in Scarecrow, who admittedly is pretty high status, and then Solomon Grundy. And I'm convinced the only reason this character has become more prominent in recent years is because of his appearance in Super Friends and then his appearance in the Justice League cartoon. Thing is, right, Solomon Grundy is a cool character and a great design, but again, there's not a lot of options. DC Universe Classics has Solomon Grundy, but he's going to be way too short for what you want out of your big, bulking monster. That leaves you with the DC Direct Arkham City Solomon Grundy, or the McFarlane Solomon Grundy. Personally, I'd say go McFarlane Solomon Grundy, because he's a little bit more stable, he's a whole hell of a lot cheaper, and I think he has a more striking appearance. Granted, neither one of them look like Solomon Grundy from either the cartoon or the comics, so you just kind of have to deal with it if you want the trio. That said, if you wanted to, you could use DC Universe Classics Grundy. Thing is, he's incredibly expensive, and even though he has the appearance you'd want, he's just so short. From here on out, these characters have incredibly slim options. And it's unfortunate because we're just now getting to the Wonder Woman villains, and specifically Cheetah, who typically is in contention for Wonder Woman's main archenemy. The issue with Cheetah is that there's just not many figures of her. You have DC Universe Classics figures, but one, they're not great, and two, they're too short. You have the Alex Ross Cheetah, which looks great, but is basically a glorified statue, and unlike the Toyman, I don't think the appearance alone saves it. But if you're like me, and maybe you grew up with Cheetah being an actual cheetah in the comics and the Justice League cartoon, I think you'll find that the Essentials Cheetah is probably the best way to go. Articulation's wonderful, the paint is good, the sculpt is great, and it does have a lot of mobility to it. You can get into a lot of varied and interesting poses. It helps that the head sculpt is incredible and really does capture Cheetah's design. Okay, I do have some balance issues, admittedly, mostly just due to the fact that they put in her claws in her feet. Oh, here we go. There we go. But with all that said, Cheetah definitely has the fewest options of anyone we've looked at so far. Even Solomon Grundy at least had a couple of strong contenders, whereas here, you kind of have to use the essentials. But thankfully, this is one of the cheaper essentials you can get, so it's not going to hurt you too badly. Our second Wonder Woman villain shows why I was so hesitant to make this video. Giganta literally only has one option. You see, despite being a member of the Legion of Doom, and one of my personal favorite DC characters, mostly on the back of her appearance in the Justice League cartoon, Giganta just doesn't get much. There you have the Justice League Unlimited Giganta, but that's in the Bruce Timm art style, it's too short, and it can't stand up. Really, for an articulated action figure, you have the Mego Tribute Giganta, which is only 8 inches tall and would look horrible with a McFarlane figure, or you could go with the DC Universe Classics Giganta. Now let me just say this, right? The DC Universe Classics Giganta is one of the best figures they ever put out, and it's probably their best Build-A-Figure. But that shows in the price. Giganta on eBay sells for around $300 to $400 pretty easily. And even though this figure is terrific, and I love it a lot, that's a lot of money. That's more than the rest of this Legion of Doom put together, basically. That said, it does scale well. Giganta does appropriately tower over the rest of the Legion. The figure looks great. The painting is perfect. The sculpting is solid. The look alone is so unique on a shelf, and it helps just really anchor everything. Giganta might be the best figure here in this lineup, and it kills me that it's so hard to get, and it also kills me that there's no real alternatives. That's probably the reason this Gigantic goes for so much. So many people want a Legion of Doom shelf, and this is the only option for one of the core members. Going from Wonder Woman to Flash, let's talk about Captain Cold. Oh, and by the way, hey Rubik's Cube, I know that this is one of your favorites. Thing is, right, Captain Cold, despite being one of the Flash's main villains, isn't Reverse Flash, and thus doesn't get many figures, because Reverse Flash gets several figures just because it's just Flash again, but in yellow. Thing is, for Captain Cold, for this scale, you have maybe two options. You can get the DC Collectibles New 52 Captain Cold, which I don't think looks particularly good. You could get the DC Collectibles Legend of Tomorrow Captain Cold, which doesn't look like Captain Cold from the comics, but hey, if you like the show. Or you could get the McFarlane Multiverse Page Punchers Captain Cold, which he's never looked like this in the comics. It's a very different look, but at least the general beats are there, you know? He has the parka, he has the blue, he has his gun, he has his gloves, he has his boots. I don't necessarily love this Captain Cold, but I'm going to come out right now and say this is your best option if you want a 7-inch Legion of Doom display, because Leonard Snart isn't getting a classic figure anytime soon, more than likely, especially after the Flash movie blew up. So, I mean, it's a Captain Cold. As much as I like this figure, because I do legitimately like this figure, it really is a case of this is the best of what we got. Thankfully, the other Flash villain on the Legion of Doom has a lot of representation. Gorilla Grodd has to have a lot of representation because he's probably the other major member of the Legion. If Luthor is 1A, Grodd is 1B. It helps that in the Justice League cartoon, he's the founder of the Secret Society, and him and Lex's rivalry was one of the key aspects of the last 2 seasons of that show. Gorilla Grodd has always been one of my favorites, and it's kind of great to see just how many options you have for the guy. So you have DC Universe Classics Gorilla Grodd, which, even though it'd be short, it would still work. Even though Gorilla Grodd is supposed to tower over people in the comics, you gotta remember, in real life, gorillas can come in a lot of sizes, so I could see that being perfectly fine. I just don't personally like the tubes all over him. The DC Collectibles Gorilla Grodd has a great kind of Charles Darwin-inspired head, and you gotta admit, it has a really solid look. I personally don't like it just because it doesn't have that much articulation, but it would definitely work. For me, personally, I'd go with the Page Punchers Grodd. Now, granted, this is a very gaudy kind of Grodd, but I like it a lot. I love the cape and chest and loincloth. It all works for me. The articulation's great, the sculpting's good, the paint is solid. You can get this figure for cheap. For all those reasons, like, I totally would go with this Grodd. And there's also, like, a cool parallel here, because hear me out, right? They did not design for this. But you gotta remember that these two are the main rivals within the team vying for leadership, and I kind of like the fact that they have armor that has a lot of similar designs in them. Like, they both have the big shoulder pads, they both have the unique chest emblems on their logos, they have the kind of awkward triangle near their crotches. It's kind of funny. So for that alone, I'd say, like, this edges out the other Grodds for me. Going into Aquaman's representation, you have his arch enemy Black Manta. Now, Black Manta has a lot of really solid figures you could choose from. You have the New 52 Black Manta, which looks great and still goes for pretty cheap. You have the DC Essentials Black Manta. Once again, very good looking figure, could definitely work. For me personally though, I went with the McFarlane Black Manta. One, because I like the swords. Like, I don't know why, just there's something about that, the arm-mounted blades, that really work for me. And the sculpting and painting were all super solid. There's also the fact that this is a very affordable Black Manta, and that does have to play a factor in this. So, for me, I'd say just stick with McFarlane on this one. The other Mantas are all great, and they're all also decently cheap, so it's not like you're going to be breaking your bank on any of them, but, you know, they also all kind of look similar. Black Manta's not a costume that changes a lot. Just go with this one. It articulates the best. Finally, you have Green Lantern's archenemy, Sinestro. And I'm gonna level with you guys. This is the only figure on my shelf where I hate the figure I have. Not because it's a bad figure. It's the DC Universe Classic Sinestro, arguably the best Sinestro figure ever made. The issue is, it's a 6-inch scale figure and is way too small to go with the others, but it's the only Sinestro I have. The real figure you should use for this is the DC Essentials Sinestro, but it goes for nearly $100 now, because it's the only 7-inch Sinestro ever made. Now, there are other options, right? You could go with some of the older DC collectible Sinestros that get into the scale, but none of them are really all that well articulated. It kind of comes down to, are you going to spend the money on the essentials, or are you going to cheat a DC Universe Classics figure? And let's just talk about this real quick, right? I know Green Lantern's not incredibly popular, but literally ever since they started this line, McFarlane's box, like dead in center in the background, has Sinestro and Green Lantern on a comic cover. They've been there on all the boxes since day one. Why can't they just make a Sinestro? They've made a few Green Lanterns. They're good Green Lanterns. Just make a Sinestro. That's all I need, man. But on that note, that's how we end. With a character that doesn't have many options, that I kind of just had to settle with what I had with. All in all, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a very flawed collection of mine. And it's just a reality that if DC doesn't care about the Legion of Doom that much to present it that often, why would the people with the DC toy license care to give it proper figures? It's an unfortunate situation because this is a beloved part of DC fandom, and it's riddled with things where you just have to say, well, that's good enough, or we'll compromise with this one. There's a handful of figures here where you have multiple options with where to go, right? You have Luthor, Riddler, Grodd, Bizarro, to some extent Scarecrow, and Brainiac. With those guys, you have options. You know, half the team. Black Manta as well. But then for so many, especially Giganta and Sinestro, you don't. You just don't. It's a thing where, like, I would love maybe one day for McFarlane or DC Collectibles or whoever, maybe even a company like Mafex or Mezco, to be like, hey, this is the year of the Legion, or this is, you know, the 2 years of the Legion, and it's like every month we're releasing one member, and that's supposed to be like the definitive take on that character. That'd be amazing, but I don't feel like it would ever happen, because even though there's some A-listers here, the simple fact of the matter is, Joker's not here, Mr. Freeze isn't here, Catwoman's not here. It's one of those sad things where, like, Batman has dominated so much of the mind space of people's idea of DC, and especially DC villains, where you look at this, I think a lot of people would say, like, oh, okay, so Riddler is here, I know him. Scarecrow was in a video game once, I think I remember his levels. Luthor, that's Superman's guy, right? Like, how many people who are huge Batman fans would necessarily care about Giganta, right? How many of them would care about Toyman? How many of them would care about Captain Cold or Cheetah? And I feel like, even though these other characters have huge fandoms, would they be in for an entire Legion? It's a case where you have to be a fan of DC as a whole, or the Justice League as a whole, to want a full Legion of Doom shelf and a full Legion of Doom lineup. And I just don't know if enough people out there care enough about Giganta and Toyman and Bizarro and Brainiac and Cheetah and Captain Cold to make that work. We can't even get most of these characters in movies, for God's sake. So, with all that in mind, with everything I've said about this being a shelf of compromise, I still love it. It is my favorite superhero shelf in my entire collection, because I finally have a full Legion of Doom. And I hope this video might help out people who also want full Legions of Doom shelves. It's a very cool collection to get together over time. And with all that said, thank you everyone for watching, and hope this helps you out.